Welcome to Matthew 5:15. My name's Matt Vanderpeer.
And this is Michael Netterfeld.
Well, Michael, it's good to be together and to be discussing what actually I think will be a really interesting conversation between yourself and a friend of yours, a guy by the name of Scott Bignell. Can you just give us a little bit of background in relation to how you met Scott?
Yeah, so actually quite a few years ago now, when I first started Bible college. And funnily enough, Scott put a notice on the notice board basically inviting anyone who is interested to engage in some debate on things pertaining to first century Judaism and church history and stuff like that.
Fantastic. And you took the bait, so to speak.
Yeah, I accepted the invitation.
You did. Fantastic. Yeah. Was it one of those... was it one of those little notices that has like a little pull-off phone number and you...
No, not quite. Just the email that I wrote down.
So you sent an email to Scott and things proceeded from there?
Yeah, we've just been meeting on and off quite semi-regularly and engaging in those kind of conversations.
Great. And so always conversations about faith, but obviously coming from two fairly different perspectives.
Yes, so that's why I said funnily enough, because Scott would, I'm not necessarily confident he would call himself an atheist, but that's probably the simplest way to put it. So there he is using that library and putting his notice board up in the Bible College library as an atheist, so to speak, wanting to engage with some Christians.
It's great. It's really a bold move, isn't it, to go and put a notice on a notice board in a theological college.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I really like that as well. And so you've known him for now quite a number of years, and the conversation is ongoing. And actually what we're leading into is a recorded conversation that you and Scott had not so long ago.
Yeah, so in the spirit of the 2020 pandemic, we decided to record our conversation on Zoom. And hopefully it's a little bit engaging and a little bit helpful for people. We feel like it was one of our more balanced conversations.
That's good. It's good to hear. I understand the format that you use is actually one where you kind of interview each other and ask each other questions. So, look, I'm very much looking forward to listening in. I haven't seen the recording or the full recording just yet. Yeah, just interested to see what's going to pop up in terms of topics and conversation. I believe you go a little bit into each other's background and history and that side of things as well.
Yeah, so a little bit of the backstory of our faith journeys or non-faith journeys. And we try and dive into a couple of topics that we would often bring up in our conversations.
Great.
Gone by.
So in some ways you could say that the material is rehearsed, but just over lots of coffees and food and different catch-ups.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff that gets recycled in our conversations, but that's normal. But however, there were a couple of surprises for me. Some things I hadn't heard from Scott. I don't know if there was anything mutual there, any surprises from me for him. But hopefully, if for those atheists who might be watching this, you'll get something out of it and agree with some things Scott says, and hopefully for the Christians out there, you might appreciate some of the things I said.
That's great. So one of the things I'm interested in now is each person's goal to convert the other person to, like, is your goal to convert Scott to Christianity, his to convert you to atheism? Is that fair, or has that been discussed?
I'm not sure Scott would feel comfortable putting it in those terms, but certainly from my perspective, we know each other as Christians. That's what Christianity is, isn't it? We want everyone to come to what we believe is the truth.
Absolutely. So that's, I think, the exciting part about this discussion. If it's a discussion around a search for truth, then it should be really interesting. So looking forward to what you guys have in store for us.
Excellent. Yep. Let's dive in.
Awesome.
I believed in Jesus and God as a child. I don't remember when I first started believing. It's just, most of my memories don't go beyond the starting years of primary school. So, I mean, obviously we did RE classes in primary school from grade 1. And I remember believing in those lessons. And I remember my parents weren't particularly religious, but if you asked them, they would have said they did believe it. They were Christians, they would have said. We would occasionally read like a, Bible stories for kids kind of book, but not like regularly, and not like it was just like one of the books. It wasn't like this is the truth kind of thing. And I think my parents would read it to me because they had like classic stories, like the Noah flood and this kind of thing. Not so much because they're like, this will help you escape the wrath of God or something. It's, but yeah, no, I certainly remember believing as a kid, definitely, and having a maybe a slightly arrogant sense of believing as well, like most smug little kids.
Would you say you at some point had some kind of born again experience, and also if you add in there something that your church experience?
I never had what I could say my church, because we didn't go to church very regularly. So, no, I was thinking I don't have a specific point where I remember giving myself to Jesus, but there may have been one. I don't know. Like that's the thing. I saw both my memory. It's like, well, I must have started this belief at some point, and I don't remember when or why specifically. I just remember believing as a kid.
Okay, and so with the small amount of church experience you did have, would you have rated that quite positively, or?
Yeah. I've written down here, what I describe my beliefs in the past, I described as vague Christianity. In the idea that I believe that Jesus was God's son who'd been here on earth, thousands of years ago, and he was somehow some sort of all-round hero of moral righteousness and forgiveness, and he was a miracle worker, this kind of thing. And I suppose, I really wish I could remember more, but I wrote down, I suppose I believe the resurrection was sort of God's sign of his vindication of Jesus. Like, that's probably how I would have understood it.
Okay. So just to get a little bit more of an idea of the church experience, do you recall it being not boring? Did you go to the Sunday school section of it? Or?
Yeah, I see, one side of my family are Catholics, and so most of my memories of church experience would be when we were staying with them. I'm thinking once every now and then, and they'd take us to the church on Sunday kind of thing. I don't remember what church. I remember also. I remember also asking my mum at one point, "Can we go to church one weekend?" And she was kind of like, "Yeah, okay." And we went along. And I don't really remember. I don't know. Maybe I do sort of remember, because I think I might have been a bit older at that point, maybe like 10 or 11 or something. And I do kind of remember thinking, "Oh, that's a bit weird. That's not what I remembered it like." I don't know. I might be just projecting memories here. It's really hard for me to remember the details. I just remember the things, like we went there, and I remember going up and eating the cracker once and that kind of stuff. But I don't remember like details of what I was thinking. So from that point, you start seeing the idea of, Savior Jesus becomes a bit of a superstition kind of thing. But then that happened long before then I sort of came to see the idea of a theistic God in the same kind of way. There was a long period of time where I would kind of pray to Jesus or pray to God. And even though I'd sort of recognize, well, Jesus probably didn't actually walk on the water, but he's kind of God's representative kind of thing, that you'd pray through, or even just sort of after that, just praying to God, thinking that there is a theistic God there who's actually intervening and doing things and interacting with the world. And so I would sort of come to see that as not necessarily based on just, me thinking myself. And then after that, I probably still went through a stage of like being a deist, of thinking, well, there's something rather than nothing, God, but then that just seems, that just sort of becomes superfluous after a while. It doesn't have any explanatory power. It's just kind of like, well, whatever. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
I didn't describe it very well, but for me, it's when I was writing this down, I sort of saw it as three stages. Coming to see Jesus, super Jesus as better understood as a superstition, coming to see the idea of a theistic God as a superstition many years later, and then many years later again, coming to see just the whole God concept altogether as kind of superfluous.
Yeah. So just to clarify, with the time frames, when like a teenager, when you first started,
yeah. So I'd say the Jesus thing probably
quite a lot of the Bible and started to coming to that conclusion.
I'd say the Jesus thing, I kind of suspect, and again, my memory's probably wrong, but I do remember Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical, came to Brisbane. And I remember all my friends getting right into it. And so we started listening to the soundtrack and watching the movie and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's possibly a big factor in the first time I sort of remember seeing the story from a different point of view, from more of a political angle, more of a social, socio-cultural, political kind of angle to what was possibly going on. And that kind of makes more sense of it. That it is kind of like this, like that, the movie's kind of done like it's this guy who's just swept up in like this hippie revolution kind of thing. Now, of course, they're commenting on their own time when they wrote the movie. But at the same time, it's kind of actually that kind of makes a lot of sense of things. That it's kind of like this guy that just got swept up in all this paraphernalia, in all this like hype.
Yeah.
I
hadn't heard this before. So which would bring me to just another clarifying point. Were there other influences like that musical, such as books or some people you'd listen to or friends who were?
I don't remember specifics. That's the only one thing I'd say I could probably point out specifically. And that, like I said, that's probably like 10, 11, 12, around that age. I think I'd probably stopped believing in a theistic God by probably early 20s.
Yep.
Probably God thing altogether by late 20s.
I actually like to start with before my upbringing with my parents. So my parents weren't Christian when they first got married. And as they tell me, their relationship was far from healthy and quite abusive in some respects and wouldn't have lasted. So long story short, through some prayers of grandmothers and whatnot and invitations from aunties, my mother got what we would call saved, born again in a Pentecostal church in Gympie here, Queensland. And my father was about a year later, I think. And this was what they said saved their marriage. Okay, so that was what I was born into, to these two Christian parents. And from my perspective, I think they gave me a very good example of perhaps what Christians should be. They had a genuine faith or a sincere faith. Were very disciplined in taking us to church every Sunday and getting us off to Sunday school and all that kind of stuff. So I guess for the individual aspect and me owning it for myself, I mean, gradually having that church experience and what I would call experiences with the presence of God in church, but also personally with what I observed to be answers to prayers and that kind of thing. It was about the age of 10 where I, one night before going to bed, felt I should pray to accept Jesus into my heart. That was the understanding I had there of salvation. So that's quite still a vivid memory for me. And without sounding too super spiritual, it was as if he was there in the room with me, and I felt perhaps, how should I say, his joy or his happiness at my decision at that point in time. I felt that mutual joy, and so ever since, I guess God's been that central part of my life where it seems to me to be. He seems to be the most important thing. And so, teenage wise, it wasn't easy. teenagehood always brings its own set of challenges. So living out faith among friends who aren't Christians was difficult. But post high school is when I felt I wanted to make up for lost time as well, and sort of stepped into being more serious about my faith again. Yeah, that's probably the short of it.
I mean, I got to ask this: do you feel that the fact that you were brought up in such, where there's this understanding of the, the Christian God has helped your parents stay together, and obviously, you as a person, well, I'm here. That's a good thing because I'm here. Do you see that as a potential factor? And also, if you're going to church regularly, your parents are disciplined in getting you to church regularly. How, from someone like my point of view, might see that as, well, there's a lot of potential psychology there to encourage you to believe.
Sure, absolutely. And no, I agree. I think there's strong cultural forces which can make people want to believe and want to remain in belief, because that's where your network of friends and family are. And actually, I felt that very strongly once when I was dating a girl of another, quite a distinctly different denomination, and thought occurred to me one day when, if she's right, what would that mean if I actually embraced her set of teachings and doctrine? How would that affect my friendships and networks? And it was quite a shocking kind of revelation. And so it gave me a bit of an understanding of how difficult it might be for someone to let go of previous beliefs or to adopt belief. So yeah, no, I agree. So I'm conscious of that bias, or conscious of that force.
Potential for bias.
Yeah. And but I feel I'm mature enough that I've worked through sorting the ideas of those forces and my own experience with God. I think I've sorted through that. I've gone through that process, if you would.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd love to probe more on that, but we're gonna.
Sure.
Okay. Was there a point in time where you would have once said that that you thought that the Christian God was a superstition, even if it was just momentary?
Yeah. I mean, I've put myself in your shoes. We've known each other for quite some time now, so I think you've been a good help for me to try and see through some different lenses. So there's that, and even Bible college, my experience with Bible college and wrestling with some of the questions, some of the more difficult theological questions. Definitely. I would have said there's been a few times where I'd almost call it a crisis of faith, where you put yourself in those shoes long enough to feel as though you've almost lost it. But I mean, not long enough. I haven't been in the shoes long enough to say that I've let it go.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I've always had that faith, held on to the faith. So if you want a specific, perhaps an example?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Probably the first one that comes to mind was, no, I'll give you two. So the first one, working through Bible college, and I'm sorry to anyone that might be watching this who is a Calvinist, but the idea...
Give it to him, Michael. Give it to him.
The idea of a God who arbitrarily selects some for salvation and whilst overlooking others. I know that's a very simplistic, crude way of putting it, but that's what it boils down to, I feel. For me, at least.
Can I just ask you on that? Because you've told me that before. What gripes you most about that? Is it the idea that this just doesn't seem like a loving God, and we're trying, in one sense, we're trying to say he's a loving God, in the other sense, we're saying this thing that just doesn't seem to mix with that? Or is it the idea that you just don't see it in the Bible?
Definitely it seems inconsistent with a loving God. Yes. So there's that side of it, and perhaps illogical. I'd also say without the Calvinists' dictionary of, mysteries and the two wills and all that kind of thing, it turns into a whole list of contradictions, I think. But
That's exactly how I feel with the Trinity.
well, let's stick with the question though. So the crisis of faith. So yeah, that was a moment where I thought, well, if the Calvinistic God is the only biblically justifiable God, in terms of is that where all of the biblical passages lead you to? That sort of at that time was quite a shock to me. I thought there's no way I could worship a God like that.
Mm.
So again, sorry to anyone that might be watching this who is a Calvinist, but that's just how I felt at the time. And anyway, so that led me to obviously look into the other perspectives, provisionism, traditionalism, and Arminianism, etc. So, and I felt through that journey, I was able to come out confidently in roughly one of those positions, and know that Calvinistic perspective was not necessarily the only justifiable perspective.
So what was the third one there? You said Calvinism, Arminianism. What's the third one you said?
Sorry, in terms of the frameworks, theological frameworks that stand in opposition to Calvinism, would be Arminianism, traditionalism. I think provisionism and traditionalism are basically the same thing. So it's really just...
Okay. What's the difference between Arminianism and provisionalism?
That would get us into one of the rabbit warrens we want to avoid.
I'm just curious. I don't know what the difference is.
Yeah, well, let's return to that, and I'd like to
list.
not misrepresent it. So if I actually have a little bit more in front of me,
fair enough,
better justice, we can come back to it. But the other crisis of faith, I think, was wrestling with the question of the fate of the unevangelized. But from a simplistic point of view of thinking of all of the millions of people in the world who haven't received the gospel, or that explicit chance to respond, if they're going to hell, I thought that was a horrendous idea. So that was another, I think, point in time when I seriously questioned whether the Christian faith could hold.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I mean, working through that, I feel much more confident in being able to answer it. Excellent. So my next question, Scott, was, we'll go with this one. What would you say now is the strongest argument, I guess, against Christianity? And you might want to answer this by saying, well, it's a combination of several.
Yeah, it's sort of. I had answers to 3 and 4, sort of similar. You were talking about, lying in bed and praying, and having a born again experience. I would say I had the opposite experience, in that as I started thinking about it more and asking the question, is this true? And then throwing that question to God, asking him sincerely from my heart, in lying, And so for me, the strongest arguments against a theistic God is the argument of silence. The most important figure in all of history, whom your eternal destiny relies on, trusting in, who supposedly died and rose again into a super physical, immortal body. He had to go back to heaven. The reason I stopped believing in God is kind of the opposite to you. And you were saying you had, a born again experience while lying in bed, praying and feeling that you asked Jesus into your heart and this kind of thing. For me, I feel like I had the opposite experience, in that I started thinking, well, is this true? And so I thought, well, the best thing to do is to throw that to God. And so I would pray and sincerely, when you're a kid, you pray for certain things. You pray for a toy or like something selfish. You get a bit older, you start praying for less selfish things, help my brother, help my mother with this particular issue. You get a bit older still, you start praying for bigger things like, help the world and this kind of thing. And at that point, it sort of becomes kind of empty, just sort of, we'll do what needs to be done. So I started asking, well, are you there? Is it actually true? Is this prayer, are you hearing this prayer? Like, and I didn't detect a response. And there's only so long you can do that before you start questioning, well, is it just me talking to myself? And, at the same time, I would think I was getting answers from God, but it was like general, expected moral answers with no specificity to them. It'd be like, do what you think's right, and don't hurt anybody. Take people serious. Whatever it is, like do the right thing, basically. And it's like you start to think, well, is that God or is that just me? Am I just talking to myself? And the inability to indistinguish the difference, it becomes superfluous after a while.
Yeah, right. And yeah. So,
but then that's theistic God. The Christian God specifically, I think, the strongest argument against him, I think, is just the idea that a loving God, his determining factor in your eternal destiny is having you put your trust in this Second Temple Judaic cult leader from 2,000 years ago, who it said was, died and rose again into a super physical, immortal body. You think, wow, that's kind of cool if it's true. And yet he had to go back to heaven. And the guy having to go back to heaven bit just kind of smells a bit like he probably just stayed dead. And that's, they had to come up with a reason. Well, if he's raised again, where is he? Oh, he had to go back. It smells a bit, that part.
Okay. And for anyone watching
so
this,
I would say, I know it might not sound like a very strong argument to a lot of people. To me, that's like, this smells fishy.
Well, no, I hear what you're saying. I mean, and as I was just saying, to anyone viewing this is something that comes up in conversations between Scott and I, has come up quite regularly in our conversations over the years.
It's the argument of silence, basically.
Yeah. And I guess the question I'd like to ask now, though, is, I mean, is it still within the realms of possibility that, you've asked in the past, is it still possible that in continuing to ask now or in the future that he might reveal himself to you?
Well, that's up to him because he knows I've asked the question.
I mean...
And he knows that question still stands anytime.
So you're saying you don't want to ask anymore? So
I don't need to. The question's asked. Like, the question's out there. It's waiting to be answered.
Okay.
Why would I need to ask again?
I guess from what I see, there are a few occasions in the New Testament and where it talks about being persistent in prayer.
Well, see, persistence in prayer is also a great way to set up to establish a simulacrum as well. Be persistent with it. Now, if God is true, he knows that my prayer was sincere. And he knows that I also asked it multiple times over multiple years.
No, that's a fair call.
I'm happy to ask it now. God, if you're there, and you're true, and, are you there?
That's fair enough. So we'll move on, I think, from that question. And
hang on, I'm getting a. Someone's wanting to enter the call. No, I'm kidding.
I was waiting for something like that. So the other question, I think, in line with this, with what you were saying as well, is how do you account for the belief in the resurrection and the beginning of Christianity, the gospel accounts? What do you do to be so confident in dismissing those accounts?
I don't know if I'd say I'm confident in dismissing them. It depends on what you mean by that. Because there's a lot of parts in the stories that I don't know whether they're intended to be historical stories or they're intended to be allegory or it's legend or it's history or it depends on the moment. Anyway, let's not get too technical. So how do I account for it? I'd say I don't know. I'd say it's some combination of history, legend, and some lies. Some combination of those three. Now you can put it together almost infinite ways. You could say it's 99% lie. This is the lie. That's the lie. That's the lie. You could say, well, that's the legend and that's history. Or you could say, no, it's actually very, very maximal. Most of it's history. See, that bit's a bit off, but and you can put all the different combinations together. There's so many ways it could have come about to be what it is that I don't claim to know how it came about. But I'll tell you the best explanation I have. And probably know where I'm going here. This is my best guess. You have Jesus, who's an apocalyptic Second Temple Jewish cult leader follower, with devout followers of Jews, who, as Second Temple Jews, probably already had some sort of expectation of an imminent day of wrath and future bodily resurrection and this kind of thing. They're a community of who have visions and trances and revelations. That's the kind of mindset of the cult. They're into that stuff. And many had given up everything for the guy. They'd left their families, they'd left their loved ones, they'd left their livelihoods. And they sincerely believed that Jesus was going to be the one installed as the king of a restored Israel, after Yahweh was soon going to intervene and establish, some sort of earthly kingdom, utopian kingdom, via a cataclysmic intervention. The great day of wrath, this kind of thing. They thought that was coming, and that the resurrection was coming, and all of this stuff. Jesus goes to Jerusalem, gets crucified. The community felt dejected. The community had become their family at that point. And I imagine there would have been a lot of cognitive dissonance, stress on them. What were they to make of, that their leader had just been crucified in such a brutal way? And then, my understanding is, when it comes to visions and things, the most common visions that people often have is of recently deceased loved ones and of religious figures. And of course, Jesus would have been both for those people. And so my guess is that someone like Peter, someone like James, the brother, they're struggling about what to do, how to keep the community alive. They see Jesus. I saw Jesus. And I don't know whether they actually saw him or whether it was just kind of told as a way to keep the community get together. But the next thing you know, it takes off like wildfire in the community. Everyone's seeing Jesus. And I think some people are just, innocently thinking they're seeing him, but they're not. It's a hallucination or something else. They're just misinterpreting something. And I think there's probably, just like in Pentecostal churches today, when you have a lot of people who are sincere but just mistaken, then you have probably a good chunk of people who are just kind of going along with it because they see the benefits in it for the community. That's how I think Christianity got started. And I think from that point it snowballs. And by the time you get to the Gospels, it's already like taking on these different forms of legends and of what the resurrected Jesus said and did to who and who saw him and when and all this kind of stuff. And also I think by that point there's starting to get a bit of schisms within the community, and you're getting different sects who are appealing to different traditions that have come down to them. And so, when you get the resurrection stories, they're trying to, John's trying to tone down Peter a bit and trying to put up, the beloved disciple and that kind of stuff. So that's how I see the belief, my best guess as to how it started.
Yeah, which was basically going to answer my next question about where in the Gospels it mentions things on the lines of people touching Jesus and eating with him.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that stuff, I think that's the resurrection stories, I think, in the Gospels. You don't get any of that stuff in Paul. And so I think what's going on is, so Mark, the earliest Gospel that we have, doesn't have a resurrection appearance scene, so far as we can tell. Or either that or it was lost, the original one. Matthew, it's kind of more this weird thing that they go back to Galilee and they, Jesus has a very brief speech and he presumably ascends. And it's in Luke and John where you start getting these stories about, him being more physical, but at the same time in John, he's floating through walls and this kind of stuff. And I think those stories are more propaganda trying to stress a particular view about the nature of Jesus' body, about what this particular community who put this text together thought about the nature of Jesus' body. Because I think that's a big question in early Christianity. So yeah, I don't see the events of the resurrection stories as all that historical. I think what's underlying them is the tradition of visions.
So just quickly then, conservative scholars and evangelicals would hold that the Gospels, New Testament, basically was all completed in the 1st century. If that is the case, is that enough time for this kind of legend and speculation?
Absolutely.
Develop?
Absolutely. I think it happened pretty quick.
Okay. All right.
I'd love to add more on that if I'm allowed to.
Go for it.
I think the Gospels aren't written by the people who were there at the time. They're written by people a generation later, which is still within the 1st century. If you want to go there. I mean, I think Luke and John may be pushing into the early 2nd century. They're written in a foreign language, and they're kind of compilatory. You kind of get the idea that you get it, and that, if Paul's epistles can be trusted, which generally I think they can, within 20 years, you've got a whole lot of Christian groups in different cities around the world, around the Mediterranean world. And I think it's a different time and place then where communication takes longer to get back and forth. And you can't just call up Peter and go, hey, Peter, is this what happened? And I think the Gospels all post-date the death of people like Peter and James and that kind of people. And so they didn't have like this immediate, and you probably had the original disciples themselves probably had disagreements.
Okay.
So I think by the time you get the resurrection stories, which I date somewhere between 70 and 120, we're talking 40, 50, 60, 70 years later from people who weren't there in a different language. It's like, it's more than enough time, more than enough circumstance for, that kind of thing to start happening.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I have to ask actually, I had a slight variation on it. I wasn't just going to ask you, why do you think? Yeah. So my equivalent question is, and I do apologize because maybe you gave me time to prepare and you didn't, but I was trying to think of equivalent questions, but not just like, well, why do you think it happened? Because obviously you believe it's all true, and it'd be a pretty quick answer. So my question is, how do you account for the rise in folk thinking that the Christian God is a superstition over the past century or so in the West? Which is kind of the equivalent of, how do you think Christianity arose?
So you're talking about the secularization and the rise of atheism.
Well, more specifically on the Christian God. That more folks now, I think, in the West, either have what I might describe as a watered down understanding or belief in the Christian God, or it's become so watered, like myself, that it's not there anymore. And this has obviously become a lot more numerous over the past 100 years, I think. And what do you put that down to?
That's an interesting observation. And if I'm going to be honest, I don't think I've done enough homework on data. What I feel, though, is we need to at least consider the rise of the internet and the proliferation of these ideas. I think doesn't always reflect the numbers. Okay, so what I'm saying is sometimes you can have a very loud minority. I'm not just talking about atheism necessarily. Few numbers, but with a very loud voice when we're talking about the internet and media and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, even recently I've been looking at some articles to do with faith in general, like people who believe in some kind of supernatural or the miraculous, etc. I think the trend is still the vast majority of people do believe in some kind of supernatural. So,
well, I'm asking about specifically the Christian God, because that, in terms of the more literal understanding, that has definitely declined, I think.
Well, I think the last censuses in America and Australia revealed definitely a decline in commitment to traditional churches, or commitment to at least the every week attendance of those churches as well. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that there's this great vast watering down among Christians per se, as there is more so less commitment to the traditional sort of cultural church going ways that we've experienced in decades gone by.
So what do you put that down to?
I
know I'm kind of putting you on the spot. So.
That's fine. I don't know. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that there's far greater access to. I mean, even in we're recording this, in the middle of the pandemic, or at least on the tail end of it, hopefully, where a lot of people are being forced to get their church online, and so people have greater choice, I guess, in what voices they're listening to. So if someone's not happy with their church here, they can listen to someone in America who doesn't necessarily even pastor a church. It might be just a Bible teacher or something. So
do you think there's any, because my answer to this question is, it seems to me that it's not a coincidence that evangelicism declines as information becomes more readily to people.
Again, I'd like to see that data.
And also the the literacy rate of the world now is probably at its all-time high, definitely. And I'd say as literacy rises, as access to information becomes easier for the lay person, I don't think it's coincidence that stuff like evangelicism starts to, decline.
I do, and again, I mean, we could talk about some of the apostasy, for lack of a better word, I guess, of college-age students because of what they're exposed to in college.
And what? Well, I mean, I don't. Maybe not now, but 5-10 years ago, what was the whole point of college education was critical thinking and this kind of stuff. Anyway,
I think that would take us down a rabbit warren. I mean,
yeah.
Don't get me started on the especially in America, the left majority in colleges right now. So
I might not disagree. So
yeah. So we just for time's sake, I'm going to skip another of my questions and jump to probably the last question I've got on here, which is, what would you say the biggest benefit of no longer believing in God or Jesus is? I don't know how you want to answer that, maybe in a practical sense, and the other question which ties in with it, do you believe a society of only atheists would be the best society?
So it's really two questions here, isn't it?
Related.
What would I say is the biggest benefit to no longer believing in God / Jesus? First and foremost, having a better understanding of reality than you. It sounds really arrogant, but to me, that's the way it makes. Well, it's like it seems more true. So that's the benefit.
Well, that's a little bit vague, though. I mean, how is that a benefit?
I think you can. The better understanding you have of reality, the more informed you are to make better decisions to attain your goals or desires.
Probably putting you on the spot. Can you give me an example, though, of a decision that you think can make a better choice on?
Yeah. So when people tell me they believe something that I don't believe, I think, having come to see that the Christian faith is a superstition, allows me more openness to their sincerity. I don't just fall. I find Christians are very, very quick to fall back on the reason these people aren't accepting Jesus and the reason they're not believing it is because because within their belief system, it is that the reason they don't believe is because they're rejecting God. It's because they're rebelling or something like that. It's something to do with their heart. And I don't have that. I don't have that quick fire. Well, this guy's just not believing it because it's something to do with his moral character or something like that, a defect in his morality or something. So I think that's a benefit.
Okay. I think, and in our previous conversations, I would say, well, firstly, apologize when that has been myself, but I think that does reflect perhaps a certain vein of evangelicalism where they do emphasize.
I think it's in the Bible. I think it's right there. It's like, Paul says people know there's a God. Everyone knows. And it's like, no, we don't.
Yeah, but Paul himself wouldn't necessarily have gone up to a non-believer and shoved that in his face. That he was writing that to a
He's a
church.
salesman.
Well, he was all things to all people.
And what was the other? This is a weird question, because I tried to answer this as honestly as I could, without just going down the what do you mean by what do you mean by this, what do you mean by that? Because it's kind of a weird question to me. I don't know. This is, do you believe society of only atheists would be the best society? My answer is I don't know. The question is a bit weird to me because my coming to see that theistic God concepts as superstitious, I perceive as having a benefit for me. I don't think that was the reason why I came to think it, but I think it's an outcome of it. But I'm not sure it would be for everyone. So I don't know, and it would depend on the reason why this society are suddenly all atheists. Is it because they've been forced into atheism? No, that's not the best society. Is it because 1,000 years have passed and people have come to realize that it is kind of God thing's kind of a bit of a superstition? Then potentially yes, but it would depend on what else they're believing, because this is the potential mistake I see in the question is this idea that atheism is something you put on and go, I'm looking now through atheist lenses. To me, it's the opposite. It's like I had theistic lenses on and they came to evaporate. And so it's not taking the belief that there is no God. It's just, coming.
Can I push on that then? Let's
Yeah.
let's just hypothetically say then that theistic lens has come off on a particular society. Would that society be the ideal society, in your opinion?
It would depend on how else they're living their lives, because I know it sounds like a dodge, but it depends on how they're living their lives otherwise. Because
If I was to be pushy, I mean, if you were to be consistent with what you just said about your own personal,
that's what I'm trying. That's why I found the question difficult, because if we're going to say if everyone was came to it in the same way I did, then I'd say yeah. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the best, but I'd say it's better than one in which people are believing.
Okay.
But if other people are coming to it from, say, having bad experiences with an abusive pastor or something like that, well, I mean that's because I wouldn't use that. I wouldn't say that's not generally a logical reason for saying it's not true. So I found the question kind of hard to answer.
Okay. I mean, we could follow that through, and we could ask, are there any examples of atheistic society, and is that a model to follow? Or I'm not sure if you can think of one.
Atheism's not something to base your society on. It's a lack of a belief in something. It's not something, to me, it's kind of weird to go, we're going to base a society around not believing in fairies.
Okay, so in terms of, so if we were to use the example from China and Russia where that did happen, where we want to base our society on no Christianity as in
But your question isn't, do you believe a society based on atheism? It's, do you believe a society with only atheists? And that's different, because that would depend on other factors.
So rather than an imposed atheism, an organic.
Yeah, that potentially could be a much better society. Yeah.
Okay. And
well, kind of like. I mean, there's always going to be exceptions, but 99.99% of the world understand that the world is not flat. They do not believe in a flat Earth, and that has come about naturally through people learning about the world. Even if they haven't gone around the world, they've it's something that's come about organically. That's pretty much a given now. So that is a better society, I think, than
Based on truth.
only on the factor of they're closer to reality now.
I guess maybe where I was fishing with that question was, I mean, what would the morality be based on?
Well, that goes to
what would be the principles of that society?
the principle. You don't have atheistic principles.
I guess it might be a bit of a baited question. So, I mean, it really goes back to the fundamental of what is the foundation for morals, which would probably be a whole nother hour of conversation.
Well, I was actually the question I was looking forward to the most. So, well,
Wait.
okay. Before we go there, then let me ask you: do you think my equivalent question to you was, well, what would you say is the biggest benefit in believing in Jesus, God? And do you believe a society of only Christians would be the best society?
Thank you for returning the question. So I would say the biggest benefit of belief. I mean, I could answer it in the same way you answered it. Me would be it's based in reality and truth. So from my perspective, but on, I guess, another level, it's the purpose that is found, I guess, in the belief that we were created for a purpose and that it doesn't end, that there is an eternity. And I think just tied in with this is really, I mean, I said it in a word, it would be love. And it's knowing that you are loved by that creator and being in a relationship with that loving creator, I think is the biggest benefits of Christianity, and everything else flows from that, I think. So, which ties into the other question about, a society full of Christians. Yes, I think if everyone was a genuine Christian living the way Jesus taught, I think that would be a utopia.
A not unexpected answer.
No.
I mean, I don't have to. For some people, it might be that they need to have someone, some sort of feeling that there's a father figure or parental figure who loves them. That might be something that some people just need, and without it, it's just life's unbearable. I suppose having a pretty loving family and fiance and everything, I've never had that feeling of nobody loves me. So I don't feel the anguish that someone else might in calling out to the idea of a God who gives them a sense of someone loves me.
So I guess I would be asking then, knowing that love from fiance, from family, is going to be only temporary for a very short time in terms of the lifespan, potentially even shorter depending on what happens circumstantially. Doesn't that, if you really think that through, cause some sense of hopelessness?
No.
Or futility, maybe a better word.
No, not you don't need to feel like love is going to go on forever for love to be meaningful. Love is the moment of love is all it is. Like that's, that in and of itself.
And I certainly wouldn't want to devalue those moments of love. I agree, love's important, full stop. But when I think of things from a temporary perspective, a materialistic perspective, I feel that meaning is not possible.
It might not be,
Memory is going to be lost. It's as if we didn't exist,
but we have now.
but not after.
That's true, but we have now. And the experience of love now is
Will be
still a
forgotten.
wonderful thing.
From a materialist perspective, will be forgotten forever.
From a materialist perspective, first of all, you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist. But it still doesn't, either way, it still doesn't remove anything. It's like you're trying to say love without this isn't as good. Well, maybe not, but it's still good.
Okay, I can agree there.
It's kind of like, I kind of see it as like, that ice cream, unless it's got a cherry on top, I mean, you're missing out. I mean, maybe, but hey, the ice cream's still good.
Fair call. Okay, so just for time wise, Scott, do we have any more questions we really think we should cover before we?
I would kind of love to do question 7.
Ooh.
So maybe I'll have to try and condense it.
For our viewers, what do you base your moral compass on currently?
Oh. I was keen to do it, and the moment you ask it, I'm like, oh, this could take a while. Okay, so I need to clarify what you mean by morality, because when I use the term, I'm talking about actions that contribute to the well-being of sentient creatures who experience love and joy, as well as pain and suffering. So when I'm talking about a moral action, that's what it's in relation to. It's not about what someone has told me or about what God has done. It's about actions that contribute to that goal.
Perhaps if I was to clarify morality, if we could base it on the idea of what you would call out as evil or what someone should not do, as opposed to what they should do.
Well, to say someone shouldn't do something or should do, we have to have some sort of desired outcome. And so when I'm talking about should and shouldn't do, right and wrong, I'm talking about it in respect to this goal of, continued or more well-being, less pain, less unnecessary pain and suffering. That's the standard by which, when I'm talking about morality, that's what I'm understanding we're talking about.
Okay. So, and given all of that definition, what then do you base it on?
So there's different aspects to it. So there's what we'd call my moral desire, my desire for that. And I would say that is subjective, that each individual has that desire or doesn't have it. Most people, I'd say, have it, but to varying degrees. For some people, it's very, very important to them that this is really, really something they go for. For other people, it's less so, but they still have that desire, but it's maybe not the top of the list or something like that. So there's moral desire, which is subjective for each individual. Then there's moral intuitions, which it's the kind of stuff that you do without even really, before you even have time to think about it properly. You see a pram about to slide off a bench and you grab it before you even think, oh, I have to do that because that's going to cause suffering. And, it's a intuition. So you got that kind of stuff, which I think is, so both the desire and this intuition has come from our evolutionary history, that our brains have been molded to have these intuitions, to have these feelings, to pursue that goal, because in doing so, that's what's kept us alive and functioning as, the apes we are. Then there's moral understanding, which would be things like, that's kind of the more rationality of it, the thinking behind it. And that is the recognition that actually, yes, I do have this desire for this goal. And I recognize that my intuitions can sometimes be wrong. So in terms of incorrect, and I think saving the baby is the right thing to do, but actually it's wrong because it wasn't a baby, it was something else, but I should have done this instead, something like that. So your intuitions can be wrong. And so, I think humans have developed, the thing that we have is we've developed this reasoning capacity, and that to think things through a bit more, to take it to another level of process. And so this is where I think a lot of the question comes down to. How am I determining those kind of things? And it basically comes down to understanding the world better, because and recognizing things like that short-term pain can sometimes have long-term beneficial effects, or vice versa. Short-term gains can actually have detrimental long-term effects, always in respect to this goal of well-being and that kind of stuff. So that's, if we're talking about morality, what am I basing it on? Well, beyond the stuff that's sort of the subjective intuitions and that kind of stuff, I base it on my understanding of reality and how it works. And part of that, it would be to continue to develop my understanding of reality in order to make better decisions.
Do you see a potential issue if everyone was to base their morality in the same way that you just explained, that there would be difficulty in issuing justice? If someone was in the court and they said, well, this is what I felt was right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, how do we reconcile what you just said in a society where...
Yeah, if they genuinely, I mean, this is half the problem is we're not yet at the point where we can, where we have to set examples. But ideally, if the person was genuinely sincere, that, this person does actually have the goal of, continued well-being and less unnecessary suffering, but they mistakenly and innocently thought that killing this person or something was the right thing to do. And if they had the capacity for them to be shown that actually, no, that was incorrect, and then that would be the moral thing to do, and not to now, I know the problem is that we're not in the position yet to guarantee that we'd ever be able to help that person. If we could go in and fix their brain to say, well, this part of them that's making them think this is the right thing to do is actually not, we would. Well, we'd start to consider that anyway. So yeah, I don't think what I've stated it only creates tension in the practicality of it, not in the idealness. Well, no, I wouldn't say idealness. It's something that's is ongoing.
Yeah, I think. I mean, you've said it. I think in the practicality, I feel like I can't see how it would eventually arrive at that sweet spot, that ideal.
Well,
when
do you disagree with anything? Do you disagree with anything I've said in terms of? Do you share the desire for more well-being and less unnecessary pain and suffering? Do you share that desire?
Sure, but
okay,
I mean,
all right. So, do you understand that sometimes your intuitions can be wrong about those things?
Yes.
Do you understand that stuff like science, the process of science can help us determine better answers about what actions will be more or less beneficial for those goals?
I think science has a lot of limitations.
Absolutely. I'm not saying it doesn't, but as a tool, can it not help us determine, say, like whether a particular drug is beneficial for people with this chronic disease or something like that? Okay, so we're in total agreement.
No, because getting back to the practicality, I mean, we still have the problem of subjectivity, where
we have the same problem on the belief in a God as well, because not everyone believes in a God, and also it's subjective in terms of what people say God wants.
If we're talking about different gods and disagreeing about how he's revealed himself.
Yeah, but he apparently reveals himself to different ways. It's subjective.
Well, I mean, Christianity as a whole.
You'll find Christians disagree on every moral issue. You'll find Christians for something and Christians for and against it.
Christians, as a rule, let me just finish this one, generally believe in the inspiration of the Bible, the scriptures, And so really it comes back to more so interpretation of those scriptures. So I think with the big ticket issues, it's hard to steer away from being able to call out what the Bible says is right and wrong.
If the Bible said, I mean, obviously it wouldn't because it was written thousands of years ago, but if it said something like, well, kind of like what Jehovah's Witnesses, how they interpret it. And if the Bible had said something about you should never have a blood transfusion, would you say, well, look, as far as I can tell, blood transfusions are good things because they help people survive after accidents and when they've lost a lot of blood and that kind of stuff. But the Bible says that we shouldn't do it. You're going to trust the Bible over what you can see and with your own eyes?
Yeah, I'm not sure that example is overly helpful because Jehovah's Witnesses, and sorry to any Jehovah's Witnesses watching this, aren't considered a part of Orthodox Christianity, if you would, where that interpretation, I'm afraid to say, is quite easily shown to be.
I'm not saying that is what it's in the Bible, but let's say it did say something like that pretty clearly.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, then you start to run into some problems, like, yeah, where something is so obviously helpful and not evidently evil, and yet the Bible says something different. Yeah, of course that would be an issue.
Okay.
You'd have to find something, I guess, like an actual example to point out that flaw.
There is an Old Testament one. I'll look it up after the video, where it's like, ooh, that seems a bit dangerous. I mean, even Jesus saying, doesn't matter if you don't wash your hands before you eat. Isn't it better to wash your hands before you eat?
Okay, well, that one in context is him saying what is the most important thing. Ceremonial washing, which is what he's referring to, not necessarily talking about hygienic washing, ceremonial washing.
But I mean, it's no surprise that ceremonial washing became a thing if it had, health benefits.
I'm sure God had those kinds of things in mind when he instituted ceremonial washing. Sure. I don't think, with that example, I don't think Jesus was saying don't do it. He was just saying make sure you do the more important things. If you're going to choose one or the other.
Jesus is always reworded. Oh no, what he really meant was this wording. So my equivalent question for the moral one is it moral for God to have created a universe knowing in advance that certain individuals would likely have to spend their eternity suffering a fate worse than them having ever been born in the first place?
I'm never a fan of these questions because it's more about...
No, it's a bit on the spot as well.
No, that's fine. Yeah, but it's more about philosophizing, if I can say that word, about, what we think might be a better reality. And
well, you have conceptions about what you think is a better reality. You can't deny that you have conceptions, you have thoughts, you have ideas about what you think is a better reality. You can't just say like, no, mine are God's, mine are equivalent to God's. They're your thoughts about God.
That's a little bit more complex than that. It's how I interpret, and I interpret within our culture and within my faith community, what God has revealed in his word about reality. And so, I mean, I think for me, it's more about dealing with what I can see in terms of what is and what provision has been made according to the Bible. So, I mean, with this world of the believers and the non-believers, from my perspective and my reading of the Bible, is that God gives light enough for all men to be given that opportunity to turn to him. So in that sense, I think God is very fair.
Is it fair, though, to have people suffer forever for finite crimes?
And what I think we should do, Scott, is save that question. Actually, this is a topic that I really do want to cover on hell. And I'd like to have a little bit more preparation in terms of
Fair enough.
bring up all the scriptures